Hello, my name's Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today I want to talk about those American presidents who were able to choose great successors. So I want to emphasize the ability of our great leaders to also pick, great leaders themselves. So and this is a very crucial part of being a good leader. I like studying leaders as well. Of course, when you're studying American presidents like I do, you're studying leaders, and of course, you can also see this quality in other great world leaders as well. From the time of the Romans, I like to talk about the Roman Empire a lot as well. Julius Caesar was not the founder of the Roman Empire. He made himself dictator for life after he had all but ended the Roman Republic, right? The era of the Republic. But just before he was assassinated by, his friends, the other senators, um, he made a very crucial uh, selection choice in his adoption of his great nephew Octavian, who went on to be known as Augustus Caesar. So Caesar adopted Octavian, who was the grandson of his sister, and made Octavian his heir. So, upon the death of Caesar, Octavian would inherit the wealth of Caesar, the vast wealth of Caesar, his status, and the loyalty of Julius Caesar's vast and very lethal army, which he had used to conquer Gaul, commit genocide, and defeat his rival Pompey, the great Pompey. So it's ironic that Caesar, even though he did choose a great successor who went on to who became the founder of the Roman Empire, he also, I guess, selected his eventual assassins in sparing Brutus. He made Brutus part of um, his his leading men, and amongst the other assassins that killed him on the Ides of March, stabbing him to death. So that's ironic. But the thing is, Caesar was able to spot the qualities in Octavian, and people would have thought that, well, he would have chosen another relative of his who was more familiar to the Romans and also an accomplished general himself. That's Mark Antony. But I guess Caesar saw the weaknesses of Mark Antony, and there was something he saw in Octavian, the 19-year-old Octavian. And Caesar was right. History proved that Caesar chose well because Octavian went on to build the Roman Empire, and he defeated his rivals. And he created Pax Romana, that's a piece of the Romans, or also Pax Augusta. And, he ruled Rome for over 40 years. And of course, Rome went on to become uh, the great empire we continue to study today. And he created a great civilization with it. So, uh, from the Romans, from Caesar, who was able to pick a great, pick a great successor. Uh, by the way, Augustus spent his life, most of his mature life, trying to get a successor as well, trying to pick a successor. He would plan several different people, several marriages, but they would die and something would happen. And of course, he was always as outliving everybody, right? Augustus, who was very ill, a very frail person, for some reason, he would outlive everybody, live into his 70s, but eventually he chose his stepson, uh, Tiberius. Tiberius would become his heir. Tiberius would become his heir, a very reluctant emperor. But at least the important thing is that he established a dynasty, and that it's called the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and so he established continuity in the succession of emperors. So At least that was settled. And of course, in the United States, we've had presidents who pick their successors. Well, if you know, in the modern times, uh, the president picks his president, right? We recall how President Joe Biden picked Kamala Harris to be his running mate, and Kamala Harris, became the first female vice president, the first black person to be vice president, the first Asian person to be president, and Joe Biden himself was picked by President Obama to be his vice president, and of course, uh, Joe Biden went on to win on his own steam and became the 46th president. And um, you know, so there have been, but prior to the modern era where the president picks a vice president, right, as his running mate. Uh, at the beginning of our presidency, from about 1788 to 1800, um, the president and vice president were actually rivals, right? Everybody was contending for the office of presidency, and it's consistent with what's in the Constitution. That's in Article 2, Section 1. It says that electors, presidents were there was no popular vote then, so the electors would each cast two votes, right, for president. So the person who won the most votes became president, and the second highest scoring would become vice president. And so that's why you had rivals like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were from two opposing parties. John Adams represented the Federalists of Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson was the leader of the Democratic Republicans, or the Anti-Federalists. But John Adams won and became president, and the second highest scoring person in the electoral college the electoral vote was Thomas Jefferson, who became vice president. Now that changed that would change, however, in 1804, and we would get what's called the 12th Amendment, because in 1800 um, there was a tie in the electoral count when Aaron Burr, who was the one who, infamously killed the great Alexander Hamilton, our first Secretary of the Treasury and the architect of the American system. He killed him in a duel, right? Um, so Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson would tie, and it took about 36 votes, 36 ballots for the tie to be broken, and then for Thomas Jefferson to eventually be elected as president. So the 12th Amendment changed that, right? The 12th Amendment would change that. So they'd have a separate ballot for president, a separate ballot for vice president. Um, so this was the case. And so the modern times, though, that the president gets to pick his vice president, right? Um, that started in 1940 with um, FDR, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was our 32nd president. Is the only president who served more than two terms. He actually had four terms. So on his third term, he would pick a guy on condition, that he gave a condition to be able to run for a third term because he was immensely popular. He chose a man called Henry Wallace as his vice president, and of course, we know he subsequently chose Harry Truman, who became a very good president himself. For his fourth term, he chose Harry Truman, and of course, uh, Roosevelt would die shortly after winning his fourth term from a cerebral hemorrhage, and Harry Truman would go on to be president. Harry Truman did a lot of great things, including, he brought the Second World War to a successful conclusion, with America being victorious. He helped organize NATO and so many other things, and of course he reorganized the Department of Defense, right, the War Departments, and created the Department of Defense. He created the National Security Act. I think that's what it's called. Was in 1947, and he created new agencies with regard to defense, and importantly, he desegregated the military. So there are a number of things, significant things he accomplished. So FDR did pick a good vice president. So that's an example of a president who picked a good vice president. And of course, John F. Kennedy himself, John F. Kennedy picked a good vice president in Lyndon Johnson. John F. Kennedy, of course, was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963 by Lee Harvey Oswald. And John F. Kennedy he'd outlined a very ambitious program, landing the first man on the moon, a great civil rights program, but it took the legislative genius of Lyndon Johnson to be able to accomplish these great legislative strides. They were the legislative program very ambitious. It took a master in Congress like Lyndon Johnson to be able to accomplish all of these goals, all of these ambitious aims that the Kennedys had in terms of civil rights. And of course, it was Lyndon Johnson who built the Great Society, and he was the one who accomplished the 1964 Civil Rights Act that ended, discrimination against blacks, the 1965 Voting Rights, even the Immigration Nationality Act, the Immigration and Nationality Act, I think that's what it's called, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So he accomplished a number of very significant legislative programs, that moved America into the progressive era, right? The progressive era. So that was a very good pick by President John F. Kennedy. So a good president is able to look beyond their personal, emotional, or sentimental attachments or feelings and pick the right man for the job. So the Kennedys very famously was said to not like Lyndon Johnson, and he had no love lost for them either. But they realized he was a great presidential pick, and he ended up being a tremendous successor and tremendous president as well. Um, Now, if we go back in time as well, so the first time that, after the 12th Amendment, the first time a president and a vice president ran on the same ticket was under Thomas Jefferson and George Clinton. Now, so importantly though, in that era, up until in that era, it was the party or through a convention that the vice president was picked. So it wasn't the president who picked his vice president. Now, a departure, though, was with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln would pick Andrew Johnson for his second term. He picked him. He was actually a war Democrat. He was a Democrat, not a Republican, because he wanted to create a national union ticket. Now, was that everybody knows Andrew Johnson was the first president to be impeached. He was almost removed. He survived removal by just one vote. People didn't think he had a great presidency. The Republican Party was against him, but it was a strategic pick by Abraham Lincoln, right? At least the Southern whites, former slaveholders, thought they had an heir in the White House, and they had in Andrew Johnson, and somebody who could sympathize with them in Andrew Johnson, which he did, because Andrew Johnson himself was a former slaveholder, and of course he was a, a Democrat, only that he believed the Union was indissoluble, right? And so he supported the war to end secession. And so that was why he was on the ticket with Abraham Lincoln. But importantly, Abraham Lincoln, who was known to believe he wouldn't survive, he wouldn't live to complete his term in the White House, his second term. He believed that because Abraham Lincoln, by the way, he was said to suffer from melancholy. Uh, I've read a biography of him. That's With Malice Towards None, and the author suggested that Abraham Lincoln suffered from hypochondria, right? So that morbid belief that one is always ill, constantly worrying about his health, and he believed he wouldn't live to, he wouldn't survive his term as president. He wouldn't complete his term as president, and he expressed these doubts to friends and even his wife. But he did something. He picked someone who would end up succeeding Andrew Johnson in Ulysses Grant. General Ulysses S. Grant went on to win the Civil War and preserve the Union. He defeated the Confederate Army, and of course, he became the 18th president of the United States. So that was a great pick by President Abraham Lincoln in picking an ideal future president who preserved the Union. Um, Now, from the time of uh, Thomas Jefferson picked a very brilliant protege in James Madison. So James Madison was the protege of Thomas Jefferson, right? So Thomas Jefferson went on to write and Thomas Jefferson was one who um, persuaded uh, James Madison to write the Bill of Rights, right? To write the Bill of Rights. He also persuaded him, both of them wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, right? He persuaded James Madison to write the Virginia resolutions. I think Thomas Jefferson wrote the Kentucky resolutions, which was the basis, the rationale that a state could actually nullify uh, a law by the by the federal government, and it created justification for the states that wanted to secede, that they could secede from the union. So that wasn't such a good thing, though, for the union. Um, but importantly, I wanted to mention that presidents, while they could in the beginning, prior to 1804, they couldn't 1804, 1820, prior to the modern era, presidents could not pick their vice president, right? But they could pick the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State was a more powerful position than the vice president then, and it was often viewed as a stepping stone to the presidency. So you notice Thomas Jefferson was once served as Secretary of State. So George Washington did well. He picked very good leaders. He picked Alexander Hamilton, who became the leader of the Federalist Party. If he had lived, perhaps he would have become president as well, even though he wasn't born in America, he was an immigrant. Who knows? The Constitution may have been modified to accommodate him. Um, and so, and George Washington picked Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. And of course, he went on to become president himself. And uh, uh, now, James Monroe also served as Secretary of State. James Madison served as Secretary of State. Um, uh, James Monroe served as James Madison's Secretary of State. So that's James Madison picking well. So again, back then in the beginning of our republic, the Secretary of State position was seen as a grooming position for the presidency. Politicians who had presidential ambitions wanted to be Secretary of State because it was viewed as a grooming position, grooming office for the presidency. So, and we see that even James Monroe also picked John Quincy Adams to be his Secretary of State. We all know the Monroe Doctrine that bears the name of James Monroe, our fifth president. The actual architect of the Monroe Doctrine was John Quincy Adams when he was Secretary of State. Um, so, so that's very significant. Um, and let me just mention that while John Adams did not pick John Quincy Adams to serve in a cabinet position, but he groomed him since John Adams, he groomed his son to be a future president. So, he was a good dad there, grooming a future president of the United States. And John Quincy Adams went on to become the uh, he didn't have a good administration because he was way ahead of his time and he wasn't such a great politician. But to his credit and the credit of his parents, he is routinely rated as the president having the highest IQ through histrometrics. His IQ is pegged at roughly 175, and they say he's the president by who by far had the highest IQ. Um, so um, Another president who had a very good pick, who was able to pick a good leader, Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, our seventh president. He picked a good leader in Martin Van Buren. He picked him as his second vice president. Martin Van Buren, while he didn't have a remarkable presidency, in fact, the economy went, tanked, and he got the nickname, the unflattering nickname, Martin Van Ruin, just because the economy was ruined when he was president. Of course, that was due to the missteps of Andrew Jackson while he was president. When he created some pet banks, and it caused a depression in the economy. But Martin Van Buren created the Democratic Party, which we have to still have till today. So he picked a great organizer. So he spotted the organizational skills of Martin Van Buren, and Martin Van Buren, while he didn't have a great presidency, he was a one-term president, and it was a terrible presidency. But he used his organizational skills in creating the Democratic Party, which we still have today. So, and another president I want to mention is William McKinley. William McKinley picked Teddy Roosevelt as his vice president. Teddy Roosevelt would be the youngest person to serve as president of the United States at 42 years old. No, the youngest president we've ever had wasn't John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was the youngest to be elected as president, but the youngest to serve as president was Teddy Roosevelt after McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist. And interestingly, um, in his first term, McKinley had made Teddy Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and McKinley hated his guts because Teddy Roosevelt could talk you to death. They say today's psychiatrists and psychologists diagnose Teddy Roosevelt as clearly having bipolar disorder. So McKinley was was said to have all constantly told people to keep Teddy Roosevelt away from him, like, keep that man away from him. They said he would expostulate, he would, he'd yell in exasperation, trying to avoid Teddy Roosevelt. But he did do well. He spotted his talent in picking him to be his vice president on his second run for the presidency. And when he was assassinated, Teddy Roosevelt would succeed, and of course, Teddy Roosevelt would outshine him as president. He was more expansionist, and Teddy Roosevelt is routinely ranked among the top four best presidents we've ever had. Um, so that's it. Our good presidents were able to pick good leaders. Teddy Roosevelt handpicked his own successor in William Howard Taft. He didn't have a good presidency, but notably, William Howard Taft is the only president who went on to become Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, SCOTUS, later on. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I'm going to stop this video here, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.